Reducing emissions from shipping by improving energy efficiency is an integral part of the global drive towards a more sustainable shipping industry. In the context of the global supply chain, large commodity traders are increasingly committed to reducing their Scope 3 emissions, but may view ship emissions as marginal compared to other more challenging areas of operation, such as mining. The terms of commodity sales contracts are rarely aligned with their counterparts in cargo charter parties. This creates challenges in implementing operational measures to make shipping more energy efficient as part of the broader goal to achieve energy and process efficiency gains across the supply chain. Optimally, the global supply chain needs to operate as a continuous and uninterrupted pipeline, moving goods seamlessly from origin to destination. From a cargo commodity perspective, delays at origin and destination are disproportionately more costly than delays to ships waiting in ports. This situation is compounded by the shipping industry's tendency to use standard charter party forms that must be amended to counter contractual principles that were created for a business model that was not designed to reward energy efficiency. A prime example is the long-established principle of utmost dispatch, which provides charterers with commercial certainty in terms of the arrival of the chartered ship. This legally obliges the ship to proceed as fast as it safely can, even if a berthing delay is expected. While it's essential to maintain the commercial certainty that the principle provides, the consequence has been a sail fast then wait culture, primarily in bulk shipping, which inhibits a more widespread adoption of energy efficient operational measures such as just-in-time arrivals. While the shipping industry widely considers sail fast then wait to be a suboptimal practice in the context of reducing emissions and increasing efficiency, paradoxically, cargo owners focused on security of supply and maintaining the supply chain pipeline consider it an optimal practice. Shipping works on a derived demand basis, which means that it is controlled by external players. Shipping's business model changes in response to changes in business practice by those who use shipping's cargo transportation services, not the other way around. This requires broad collaboration and cooperation with multiple stakeholders to develop and deliver a holistic systemic change where shipping becomes a seamless component of the global supply chain pipeline. With a clear and recognized need to work more collaboratively and blend technological solutions with contractual provisions, we stand at the threshold of a new dimension in shipping that could benefit from an alternative business model. The Fourth Way project is a concept for a new business model with a holistic and incentivized approach that is focused on the supply chain pipeline. The key elements of the model will be decarbonization, digitalization, sustainability, collaboration and cooperation, all of which will be drawn together to form the basis of a fourth commercial contractual solution complementing existing voyage, time and bareboat charter parties.
So what are then the elements that will make a potential new business model for the shipping industry where we move away from pure commercial imperative to taking account of drivers for efficiency in the industry? So let's start by having a look at the situation with charter parties at the moment, voyage charter parties used in the dry bulk sector. On the screen here, you can see an example of BIMCO voyage charter parties that have been developed over the past few decades, specifically aimed at individual commodities, whether it's cement or coal or iron ore or grain. And these are the numbers of documents that we've produced over the past 10 years. Now, the numbers in the columns here, if you look at the pink one, says 83. That's not 83,000 or 83 million or whatever. It's just 83 copies of a voyage charter party. So evidently not a great demand for special commodity-based voyage charter parties in the industry. So what is being used? Well, let's have a look at BIMCO's GenCon 1994, general purpose voyage charter party. You can see it by far and away outstrips the use of any of these cargo-specific voyage charter parties. So this is the big success. Obviously, this is what everyone is using. They're just taking the sort of plain vanilla voyage charter party and adapting it for different commodities. But if we drill down a little bit deeper and have a look at the figures for GenCon 1994 over the past 10 years, you can actually see that it's declining in use itself. Year on year, we're seeing less and less final executed copies of GenCon 1994. So this is not to say that there are less voyage charter parties being done in the industry. It's the way these contracts are being used by the industry that is perhaps changing. And it's a similar story, perhaps if we look at the time charter sector as well. So dry bulk time chartering, again, BIMCO forms here. We can see the bowl time, just over 3,500, 3,800 copies in the past 10 years. Not a huge number at all. So again, these specific forms may be not as popular as we imagine. And then we look at the industry's most popular dry cargo time charter party, the NYPE form, dwarfs all of the others. So it really is maintaining the top spot. But when we look at the NYPE, again, drilling down a little bit to look at a bit more details, what do we see? What is this reflecting on our industry? Well, nearly half of all of the NYPE forms used by the industry in the dry bulk sector today are the 1946 version. That's a form that was written 77 years ago. Even the more progressive companies that moved on to the NYPE 1993, again, that's a 30-year-old form. But these two forms between them absolutely dominate the time charter market. And the newest form, the 2015, only 6%. It's a tiny percentage. So we're not really seeing people move on to the more modern forms. They're relying on older forms, which they are adapting. They're putting on additional clauses and rider clauses to make them work for current sort of business environment. So what does that mean for our industry? Well, essentially out there, we've got this old ship, the MV time charter party, that contains contractual principles that were written often decades, perhaps even 100 years ago, that are still being used in our industry because they're embedded into these contracts. And therefore, to reflect changes in the way the industry is working, changes in the way that we need to move ahead to focus more on efficiency, means we need to rewrite or overwrite some of these existing principles, which can create uncertainty and conflicts within charter parties. So we're entering a difficult area. But it's something that BIMCO's been trying to tackle for a long time. Things like sanctions. We all have to deal with sanctions in business. It's a very, very important part that we have some proper contractual provisions in our charter parties. In these older forms, there's nothing. There's no mention of sanctions at all. So over time, BIMCO has developed a series of sanctions clauses that you can put into your charter party. So it's like a sticking plaster approach to patch up what's absent or not sufficiently worded in charter parties. We've developed a standalone clause to add. Same thing with piracy. We saw the growth of piracy off the Somalian coast in 2010. For the first time, we saw ships with their crew being taken away and held for ransom. This was nothing that was dealt with within the existing time charter parties. We needed to deal with it contractually, so we developed detailed clauses to deal with that. So again, sticking plaster over something that's not quite right in these standard forms. Infectious diseases, we've just had the COVID pandemic. There was nothing really written in standard forms about how to deal with this scenario where ships were still able to sail in and out of ports or whatever, but there was a restriction on the movement of crew. And of course, essentially every single port in the world was impacted. So it wasn't a case of saying, I'm not going to that port. You couldn't go anywhere if that was your attitude. So we needed a code of operation to put in our charter parties, and so we came up with infectious diseases clauses to deal with that. And then finally, perhaps the most important thing of all that we're having to deal with in the industry is fuel and emissions. And none of these rather dated forms has much in the way of dealing with bunkers. I think the NYPE 1946 even refers to bunkers being best Welsh coal. It's so outdated. See, people strike that out. But nevertheless, we need more detailed provisions dealing with fuel and fuel types and quality of fuels and claims against fuels in our charter parties. And fundamentally, we need now to deal with emissions. How do we deal with emissions in our contracts, CII or whatever? All of these things have to be dealt with in a charter party. So again, we've come up with a whole suite of clauses that overwrite the existing principles that we find in charter parties, allowing us things to do like slow steaming, which otherwise you wouldn't be able to do unless you write a specific clause because you have this utmost dispatch obligation, virtual arrival and just-in-time arrival, adjusting the speed of the vessel to arrive at a port at a specific time. Again, you need to amend the underlying principles of a charter party to be able to do this, and this is what these clauses provide. And then finally, CAI, how do we deal with that commercially when the owners and the charterers have to work together to operate the vessel efficiently and reduce emissions and hopefully maintain a high CAI rating? So again, you need clauses for all of these things, and this is what we're doing to the existing older charter parties. It means this is getting bigger and bigger and more complicated and open to uncertainty and perhaps conflict as well. So maybe it's a time to look at a new form of charter party, a new form of contract. Maybe the charter party, as we see it now, as we move into this more efficiency-driven era, needs to be rethought slightly. We've come up with the fourth way here. So again, we can see the suite of charter parties and contracts we have at the moment: the voyage charter party, the time charter party, bareboat charter parties, and now looking at, is there another way that will complement these existing charters or offer an alternative to their use, something that's more reflective of our drive towards efficiency. The fourth way charter, as we would call it, it's not as simple as just writing a contract. I think it has all sorts of elements to it, and it needs to have a much more sort of all-embracing, holistic approach to a business model for 21st century shipping, where we're having to think about and deliver on different things than we have in previous decades. And it's got to be looking at the efficiency thing, and it's got to be inclusive of shipping operations within the supply chain. So no longer looking at simply the relationship between the owner and the charterer. How does this shipping transportation service sit within this global supply chain pipeline? And how do we work with all the stakeholders to realize the best possible efficiencies? So how we pull this together is, absolutely we need technology. We need to apply technology in a contractual context as well. I think increasingly we will see the marriage of these two things together. We will be putting sensors on board ships that provide us about valuable information about how that ship is performing, and it's going to be information that both parties need to agree to as a single truth, and that will be what contractually binds them to say we accept that as how the vessel is performing. And so perhaps in the future we can look at performance clauses that reward a ship owner if he overperforms but reduces the higher rate if he underperforms. So these sort of things, mechanisms based on data and information and technology that we get from ships in the future. And of course these two things together, technology and contracts, is how we're going to help drive down emissions on the decarbonisation agenda. And pulling all of that together, ultimately decarbonisation is one goal, but in the really long run, it's all about making shipping more efficient and making sure it can keep efficient in the future as well. So the four key elements that we're looking at: decarbonisation, absolutely top of the agenda for the shipping industry and for all industries in general. Working together with digitalisation. Digitalisation and decarbonisation very much go hand in hand. You can't really separate the two things. We need digitalisation as an enabler to drive down emissions. And to create a commercial framework for that, we need the contractualization, so bringing all these elements together, pulling them all together. But of course, for it all to work and for us to realize the full benefits of these systems, we need to work together. Collaboration is a word much used in lots of sort of contexts and lots of conferences these days, but it essentially means all of the stakeholders need to collaborate and cooperate, work together to find solutions that will drive down emissions, and that's at the very heart of it. For the shipping industry, sure, we've always collaborated to a certain extent, but now I think this concept of commercial collaboration, where perhaps an owner and a charterer really do need to decide and agree amongst themselves how they can operate that ship most efficiently, and that's going to be a key thing in the future. So all of these four elements being pulled together to create this fourth way project. And ultimately, in summary, what we're looking at here is the focus needs to be on the global supply chain, the whole thing, end-to-end supply chain, the pipeline that moves goods across this planet. Let's not forget that shipping is responsible for moving something like 80% of the world's goods. So we play a very important role, although we're seen as a marginal cost in all of this. We are seen as sort of being a reliable service that's out there to serve the needs of the global supply chain, but we need to be a tightly integrated part of that to make sure that we can realize the full benefits of efficiency in the supply chain. And to do that, we need to look and work with all of the stakeholders involved. We need alignment across the range of contracts that are used in the supply chain so we can realize these benefits and make sure there's a very coordinated approach right from end to end. And we're going to do this by combining technology in the contracts, putting the two things together so we can use the data, use the information to make well-informed business decisions and also to create new win-win incentives for parties. I think finally the big focus here has to be on creating new incentives. In some ways, the incentives we have at the moment are, in a world of efficiency, is rewarding inefficiency. The sail fast, then wait is rewarding an inefficiency. A demurrage scheme that gives you compensation for a slow cargo operation. We need to think of other ways of incentivizing the industry to become more efficient. So looking at utmost dispatch, taking away the obligation to sail as fast as you safely can from origin to destination, that needs to be looked at, so it allows us to slow steam to use just-in-time arrival and other solutions. The demurrage thing as well, that can be quite profitable for owners if they kept waiting for a period of time. We need to think as the shipping gets more efficient and we have less waiting time, what other financial incentives are going to be available to the owners and the charterers to make them want to work as efficiently as possible. And then finally, the speed and performance issue as well. I mean, that's something we can tackle immediately and in the short term, which is what we should do to drive down emissions now. Let's think about, rewarding good performance. You get paid a certain rate for performing, but if you overperform, you should be rewarded for that. It shouldn't be just based on a sanction for underperformance, which encourages owners to perhaps describe their ship in terms that sort of create a buffer to prevent sort of claims and things. Let's get data that's acceptable to both parties, a single truth, and let's work towards making the shipping industry much more efficient through a new and more efficient contract method, a new business model for the industry. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm Jong-min Kim. I'm a senior researcher at KR. Today, I'm going to talk about the safety of bunkers. And I'm also responsible for research in safety of a bunker at KR. Today, I'm going to talk about green shipping corridor. I'm given only 20 minutes. It's not a long time, but I will do my best to deliver as much information as possible. In this world, we are seeing a number of eco-friendly ships, and some of these ships we are seeing on the slide are fueled by methanol. And this is one of the ships that has the first bunkering, and many shipyards are getting ready to deliver methanol-fueled ships. That means when you talk about autonomous fuels, that was only possible in our imagination and only in theory. That was not visible, but now we are starting to see ships fueled by eco-friendly alternative fuels. They are now operating over the seas. But there is also a problem. No matter how good your ships are, how effective the fuels are, there is no point in not using them at the same time, at the right time, for the right purposes. Today I'm going to share with you how these ships are sailing, and I'm going to also tell you some methodologies that we can use for enhancing green corridor. Let's take a look at the status of greenhouse gas emission and eco-friendly shifts. There are different scenarios regarding net CO2 emissions. Despite our commitment and efforts, if the current trend continues, we can meet only the 2.5 degrees Celsius increase scenario. So at MEPC 80, net zero goals have been actively discussed, and it has come up with a stronger and stricter scenario. So in the future, we can expect we will see more eco-friendly fuel shifts. Now we are seeing more and more diversified technologies that can be used for eco-friendly shifts. As you can see on the slides, LPG, LNG, methanol, and ethanol, they are the leading examples of eco-friendly fuel. And energy efficiency is another keyword here. And all of these efforts are focused on increasing energy efficiency of ships. But there is a challenge here. So operators of ships, where are they now? Where do they stand now? They are being provided with green ammonia, green hydrogen. Then what is the best way to use them? How should we educate them in terms of using these eco-friendly fuels? We should feel responsibility to educate them. We have some ship owners in the audience today, and it is also your responsibility. Yes, we are talking about eco-friendly fuel. They are high value added fuels, and they can give some financial pressure to ship owners. A green shipping corridor to be exact, can be helpful here, and it's an arrangement between governments to facilitate trade in the shipping industry. Green shipping corridor has been introduced. As you can see on the slide, as COP27, which happened last year, Korea and the US agreed at green shipping corridor establishment. To be specific, US Republic of Korea joint statement was announced, and the green corridor will span Busan Port and Tacoma Port. And in May this year, when President Yoon Suk-yeol visited New Delhi, India, he expressed his commitment to building green shipping corridor. And he expressed his willingness and commitment to pushing forward the green shipping corridor at the summit meeting. This is the target of the Korea and the US green shipping corridor establishment. And Tacoma Port is near Seattle, and this is a part of the green shipping corridor between Korea and the US. And the feasibility study has been conducted. And this is Busan Port, and right next to it is Tacoma Port. This is the definition of green corridor. This is a corridor that connects eco-friendly ports. We used to talk about only eco-friendly ships. Now, under the theme of green shipping corridor, we are talking about ports that can offer a route for green shipping. Let's take a look at the overview of this project. And this is about establishing net zero shipping routes for the world's major ports and sea lanes through technical and economical feasibility analysis. And it also is trying to identify concrete measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from shipping based on the use of environmentally friendly alternative fuels. So this is a commitment between governments, and trade volumes at each port will be considered to facilitate this project. And you already heard about the ETS, the emission trading system, and it can incur some costs for some ship owners. So to facilitate ETS, incentives need to be provided. So ship owners and ship operators can feel compensated. And we need to also ensure additional eco-friendly ports. This is also part of the purposes under Green Shipping Corridor project. At COP27, 24 countries, including the UK, announced Clydebank Declaration. This is about building a net zero commitment, and this is about commitment to achieve net zero. The most advanced countries are joining this effort, and the announcements also includes detailed efforts and commitment about building green roads. Korea is not part of this commitment because Korea thinks 2050 is too early for us to achieve net zero. And here the concept is Green Shipping Challenge. Clydebank Declaration is centered around governments, central governments of each country. But Green Shipping Challenge includes NGOs and private sectors. And this is also part of the commitment to building Green Shipping Corridor. And the target year is 2040. And national development plans are also part of this green shipping challenges. You can see some action plans under the green shipping challenge. So how can we build green shipping corridor? How we can achieve and build a green shipping corridor have been actively discussed. There is no clear definition yet, as I mentioned earlier. But the first step we need to take is to come up with the most effective way, which is to identify the type of ships and the type of routes that have the highest volume. As you can see on the pie chart, container ships account for the largest amount of CO2 emission. Let's take a look at Busan Port and the number of ships operated. Cruise ships and container ships, their numbers are close, but they account for almost the largest volume. By cargo, by volume, some ships account for the largest share. For example, container ships. We are trying to identify technologies that can make the biggest contribution to reducing greenhouse gases, and they can help eco-friendly ship the most. And the result is what you are seeing on the slide. From port perspective, it is necessary to build fewer supply facilities. Even if eco-friendly fuels are available, without fuel supply facilities, there is no point in making eco-friendly fuel available. From number 4 to 6, you can see some development commitments for green shipping corridor. From number 7 to 9, you can see the number of available vessels that are eco-friendly fuel ready. Specifically number 8 and number 9, these fuels can be provided immediately after a call. So you can see port readiness at the level from 1 to 9. And LNG, methanol, hydrogen, they are all alternative fuels that can power eco-friendly ships. And as I already mentioned about readiness, there is a timeline. We predicted what will happen by 2030, as you can see on the slide. According to our scenario and prediction, biofueled ships can be available at all ports by 2030, and methanol will be available at only specific ports. They can be available only under certain projects. So ship owners can take a look at the readiness level of each port and choose at which port it will fuel its ships. So here we have to consider port readiness and fuel readiness. So what benefits can we expect from green shipping corridor? The following is the benefits. We can maintain our leadership in the maritime industry, especially the global maritime industry, and we can make contribution to energy leadership around the world. And we can also lead the commitment and efforts in responding to and tackling climate change around the world. And green shipping corridor can also contribute to advancing innovation and technologies. And it will also increase partnership between countries, especially trading partners. And it will enhance our presence in the world. As I mentioned earlier, 24 countries, including the UK, committed to Green Corridor. And there hasn't been a specific approach expressed around the world, but now Korea is engaged in initial research efforts. A feasibility study has been planned based on port readiness and port volume. And the feasibility study will produce which port and which alternative fuel will be most economically feasible. And that will be used to calculate our pros and cons. And we will also identify what incentives will be needed for ship owners and operators. And these are the steps we need to take to build green shipping corridor. The first step is the stage of initiation. We have to encourage ship owners and stakeholders in the industry to be engaged, to be in the commitment. For that, we have to provide incentives for them. And then green shipping corridor will be completed by following the rest of the three stages. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet with you. I am Chang Yong-lee from the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries. I am very pleased to see that many people are interested in Green Corridor, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make a presentation here in this conference. In the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries, I am in charge of vessel survey and environment-related assessment. One of the biggest issues these days is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ships, and implementing this idea has been very important at our ministry. The theme of this session is Green Corridor. Before beginning my presentation, I would like to briefly explain why the Korean government has pursued Green Corridor from last year. I would like to explain about the background and progress of our Green Corridor projects. As you know very well, in 2018, IMO announced the initial GHG reduction strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. And in July this year, IMO came up with its renewed greenhouse gas emission reduction strategy to achieve net zero by 2050. It also announced indicative checkpoints for 2030 and 2040. And one of the most important elements in this 2023 strategy is that by 2030, from 5 to 10% of the fuels for vessels should be zero CO2 fuel or near zero carbon fuel. You might be very familiar with this chart. Compared to business as usual, we have to achieve net zero by 2050. If you look at this graph, you will see how much effort will be needed. By 2030, we could reduce greenhouse gas emission by 20%, but if you try to reduce this by 70 or 80% from 2040, you need totally innovative technologies along with alternative fuels. As you may know very well, IMO announced the regulations regarding EEDI, EEXI, and CII. By reducing energy consumption, we have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions for up to 30%. And if you look at the amended IMO GHG strategy, there were some countries or governments that were lack of preparation to achieve the target. So this mid-term measure will be taking into effect from 2027. The content is that we have to manage the carbon intensity index from ships, and we have to adopt economic measures. So technical element and economic element have been introduced as midterm measures under 2023 GHG strategy. IMO is having discussion regarding this, By the end of next year, they will propose the final idea for the midterm measures based on the opinions of the member countries, including the interim goals in order to achieve net zero by 2050. We have to realize this fact that just by relying on EEDI or EEXI, we cannot achieve the target. This is why we are looking at the possibility of alternative fuel or future fuel. First, under an assumption that we can use drop-in fuel, we're working with experts to see the feasibility of hydrogen, e-fuel, bio, and methanol and LNG. The Korean government began to consider and implement pilot projects on biofuel. So in 2023, our biofuel demonstration project will be completed. Also, we will complete methanol bunkering project by 2023. It is inevitable that we have to make fuel transition. The Korean government is working with the maritime and shipbuilding industries regarding the fuel transition, and the industries are asking the government to take the leading role in the fuel transition efforts. Among various future fuels, LNG, green methanol, biofuel, and green ammonia and green hydrogen are the most prominent candidates for future fuels in Korea. You will be familiar with technical information about these fuels, but to briefly explain, LNG is the most highly commercialized fuel, but we don't have complete supply chain for LNG, and we have limits in the effect of CO2 emission reduction when we use LNG. But recently, global shipping companies, including Musk, began to work on methanol. And methanol ships have been in service since 2015, but the possibility of methanol, green methanol, as an alternative fuel has increased further. As we understand, 46 methanol ship orders have been placed in 2022. It shows how important the methanol fuel is. In the case of biofuel, the current idea is that we will mix the bio-based fuel with fossil-based fuel. According to MEPC, the 80th MEPC meeting, there were the interim guidelines adopted for clarifying how certified sustainable biofuels can be used to improve the ship's CII rating. And this will be followed up on by the member countries at IMO. When IMO adopted the 2018 GHG reduction strategy, we focused on ammonia as a prominent alternative fuel for the future. From as early as next year, ammonia engine will be released. For now, compared to the potential of ammonia, the technology is not sufficiently mature. There are many types of alternative fuel, as you see here. Representative alternative fuels are the four fuels I have just explained, and there are also other types of alternatives, including LPG and electric propulsion fuel. In terms of fuel, bunker seal, bunker diesel, or other oil fuel will no longer be effective or feasible. From now on, you have to consider the characteristics of the alternative fuel as well as the availability of the alternative fuel. You also have to consider whether those alternative fuels will have impact on the health of your seafarers and crews. So we heard the feedback from the industries, and we found that the most important thing we have to consider is to ensure safety of seafarers who are going to deal with the alternative fuel. We have to ensure the health and safety of people on the ship. And it is important to be able to use the alternative fuel without risks compared to the way we use the fossil fuels. Ensuring safety is the most important one, and we have to ensure that the technology of the alternative fuel is mature enough. And shipping companies should consider CapEx and OpEx when they use alternative fuel for the vessels. They have to also consider the amount of cost they have to spend for alternative fuel operation. Even if you adopt alternative fuels, it depends. The situation could be different depending on which region you are navigating towards, whether it be Asian region, the US, or the other continent. Considering the destination or the route you're going to use, you will face a lot of variables you have to consider. So, which is the most proper alternative fuel? This question has always been raised and discussed among people in this industry, but we were not able to get a single answer because there are so many uncertainties. The Korean government wants to address such uncertainties, and the government should give clearer clues to the industries. This is why we analyze the needs and situation of the market. And I would like to explain about the things we considered at the Korean government for our policy. Not just the IMO's decarbonization policies, but also the decarbonization pressure for shipbuilding and marine industries have been growing these days. And in the next presentation, there will be further explanation about this content. But in the EU, new regulations like ETS and Fuel EU Maritime will take into force from 2024. And if you don't take any measure, and if you arrive at the port of the EU, then shipping companies will have to bear a huge amount of cost, although I'm not going to mention the specific amount of money. And private sector, the government and academia should come together to discuss what kind of technologies they have to develop for decarbonization in the maritime sector. And they also need to discuss the priority of decarbonization technologies along with the necessary regulations and policies. And such discussion is currently going on in Korea. For example, such discussion is going on, and one of the example is getting to zero 2030 collision and mission innovation and zero emission shipping mission. Also in June 2023, we made Seoul Declaration. Besides these, there are many decarbonization initiatives that are going on in Korea. All these initiatives are focusing on how we can accelerate the fuel transition and who is going to take the lead in making fuel transition. In May this year, considering the progress at the IMO and in the industry, we announced the decarbonization strategy for international shipping. The vision is to achieve net zero by 2050. For this vision, we have 4 strategies. First strategy is to make transition to eco-friendly fleets, and on the right side you see the target number of vessels. 867 vessels will have to transition to eco-friendly fleets by 2050. This is included in our plan. And relevant regulations and laws will be improved according to this vision. And secondly, in order to institutionalize the eco-friendly fuel adoption, we need improvement in the investment environment, including government-funded funding initiatives. We have to activate the private sector's investment in this area. The private sector here includes the banking sector. We also need to target zero carbon or low carbon technologies so that we can develop technologies that could innovate the entire life cycle of the vessels. And the strategies number 1, 2, and 3 here require a lot of time and efforts. But as I mentioned before, we have to think about how we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And we have to demonstrate the zero emission routes and enforce international cooperation. And Korean government needs to take the leading role in these strategy implementation. Green shipping corridor is not just about creating a low carbon or zero carbon route between one port and another. It includes greening the infrastructure and decarbonization across the relevant infrastructure around the ports. And the cargo loaded on the vessels will face higher freight once this green corridor is fully implemented, but the true decarbonization should be achieved through the green shipping corridor. Last year in Egypt, the 27th COP meeting was held, and Korea and the US announced collaboration on green shipping corridor. And we had a discussion about how these 2 countries will establish green corridor. From February this year, we began the feasibility study, which will be completed and reported by November this year. We have come up with a draft result report, and we are discussing with the US on how we're going to further develop this study. We have 4 categories of joint research done by Korean and American experts. For example, we have studied how we can establish port infrastructure. And we have also discussed whether we can develop and establish infrastructure to deal with alternative fuel. We have also discussed the amount of cargo that will be loaded on the vessels with going through the green shipping corridor. We're also reviewing relevant policy and regulations and fundings. So we have gathered our opinions. Between Korea and the US, green shipping corridor means a lot more than you see here on surface. For example, we reached a consensus on establishing green shipping corridor between the 2 countries' ports, and we thoroughly reviewed the port conditions and infrastructure of the port in order to choose the best option. And the green shipping corridor between Korea and the US is a bit different from other countries' green shipping corridor because the Korean government and the US government have strong commitment to this idea, and it has a top-down approach. In order to shorten the time taken for preparation, we selected Busan, Masan, and Ulsan ports and Everett, Seattle, and Tacoma ports of the US as a candidate for green corridor ports. As you see on the slide, we gathered the preliminary data from the ports regarding their potential, and we guess that from 2025 we will be able to enable bunkering. As mentioned before, the Korean government and the US government have been going through green shipping corridor by using various strategies which are a bit different from other green corridor projects. The first thing is that this is government-led green shipping corridor, and the Korea-US green shipping corridor would be probably the first green shipping corridor that is led by the government side. These are what we have to do for the future. In order to conduct pilot operation of the green shipping corridor from 2027, we have to further develop the feasibility study and create a consortium including each country's stakeholders, and we will demonstrate and operate green shipping corridor. And even before we begin the pilot routes between Korea and the US, we plan to increase the green shipping corridor between Korea and other countries, including Australia and Singapore. So we hope that our pilot project or model of green shipping corridor could serve as a best practice or as a role model for other green shipping corridor projects of the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good afternoon. I'm Nayoung Wan Choi. I'm the head of International Logistics Analysis and Support Center of KMI. My topic is a little bit different from the previous presentations. Of course, the title is almost the same. I'm going to talk about Green Corridor, but especially I'm going to talk about its impact on shipping and logistics. As you may well know, Green Corridor is an important topic for the global logistic market at the national level and at the regional level. Green policies have been introduced as incentives, so it's not an option, it's an imperative. From this perspective, today I'm going to talk about some issues regarding Green Corridor, especially at the supply chain level. I hope you find this presentation useful. This is the content of my presentation. First, I'm going to talk about current status of green logistics in the maritime industry. There will be followed by a case of green supply chains in the logistic industry and supply chain strategy and outlook. This is the background. I think you must be familiar with this. There have been issues in green supply chain, and that has been very important not only for the shipping industry but other industries. At the production level, as well as at the transportation level, Green Corridor has been discussed actively. For maritime transportation, as you've just heard from the previous speaker, the industry has been talking about the shift toward eco-friendly fuel of ships and autonomous operation. And all of these efforts are for reduction in environmental pollution. They are also talking about multimodal transportation, and they are targeting modal shift. And this is an effort to reduce environmental pressure. And they're having also activities such as joint delivery and identification of the optimized transportation routes. Big data analysis and digital transportation and digital transformation and supply chain risks and resilience have been also talked about in the industry. Then what about logistic companies? Not only logistic companies, but all the rest of the companies are facing the ESG pressure. ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. Social and governance haven't emphasized enough, but compared to the two keywords, environmental side has been less emphasized and stressed. And going green has been targets for all companies. There has been a little difference and discrepancy in terms of target timing, but all of the companies share the same goal, which is carbon neutrality. Shipping companies and operators are also trying to increase efficiency, and they are targeting autonomous operation. And Maersk is one of the leading shipping liners in the world, and it is shifting its fuel, and it has a clear carbon neutrality goal. By 2030, it is trying to reduce its CO2 emission by 60%, and by 2050, it is targeting to achieve decarbonization. And I've just briefly gave you an overview. The commitment to going green in the logistic and the shipping industries. There are clear targets in the industries. And the shipping and the logistic industries have been actively identifying issues to achieve their goals in terms of supply chain and going green. As you already heard from the two previous speakers, I'm not going to give you much detail on this slide. The IMO had set clear greenhouse gas reduction targets. Specifically, by 2030, its target is 40% reduction compared to 2008 and 70% reduction compared by 2050. And alternative fuels include LNG, LPG, and green methanol. But if you want to achieve real carbon neutrality in the long term, we have to shift toward hydrogen and ammonia. Green methanol is the alternative fuel that the industry is most interested in. Green methanol is not carbon neutral, but if you consider availability and access, green methanol offers the most potential. It's the most promising alternative fuel. Compared to conventional bunker C oil, green methanol generates 95% less CO2, 99% less SOx, and 80% NOx, and 99% SOx. So Maersk will use green methanol for its 19 shifts starting from 2025. And those 19 shifts fueled by green methanol will be delivered by HD Korea Shipbuilding, Offshore and Engineering. And green methanol or ammonia or hydrogen, if they are the fuel in the future, they will be supplied only at specific ports, and those ports will be more competitive in the future. So those ports will be hub ports in the future. Next, let me briefly talk about green supply chain policies. Today, I'd like to focus on EU. EU introduced the CBAM, the Critical Raw Materials Act, and specifically France introduced EV subsidy. And all of these are part of the EU's strategy to foster its green and digital industries. EU is trying to build a reliable supply chain. Let me begin with the CBAM. EU is trying to reduce its carbon emission by 55% by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. To achieve these goals, there will be a transition of carbon emission from countries that offer stricter carbon policies to countries that have less strict carbon policies. That is why the EU introduced the CBAM. So EU introduced a certain threshold. It applies to exports to EU. So exports to EU will be subject to the CBAM, and this new law will be in effect from 2026. And the EU will ban the sales of internal combustion engine cars by 2035, especially VW in Germany will stop selling internal combustion engine car by 2033, and it will only produce electric vehicles. Next, the Critical Raw Materials Act. This March, EU introduced this act. It designated 16 raw materials as strategic materials, and those materials are included in the industries of green and digital transformation. And there is a specific goal. 40% of the materials that are used in the EU should be transacted within the EU, and they should be sourced within the EU. Next, EV subsidy introduced by France. This July, the French government announced the draft of the enforcement decree on subsidies for electric vehicles, and they will calculate a score. This score is called an environmental score, and the threshold here is a 60 points. And this subsidy will be applied to steel, aluminum, other materials, battery, assembly, and transportation. And here we should focus on transportation. So if a lot of fossil fuel is used, you will never be able to reach the threshold of 60 points. So it is highly likely for Korea to reach the to have a points high enough to get the subsidy. This will have an impact on the manufacturing hub of electric vehicles. And Korea is providing components and batteries for electric vehicles, but this subsidy system will require those production base to be relocated in the EU. I've just given you a brief overview of EU's green supply chain regulations and policies. And these new regulations and policies will have overall impact on the industries that encompass the supply chain. So transportation and the share of raw materials should be always considered when you are trying to export your items or products to the EU market. And these new regulations and policies will have a great impact on the carbon emission as well, and will create a turning point in the overall industry and having a great impact on the supply chain. Lastly, I'd like to talk about Korea's logistics industry's strategies and outlook. There is a high possibility that shipping routes and the port of call will change. Let's take an example of the port of Hamburg and the port of Copper. The route will be shortened. That means there will be dramatic decrease in CO2 emission. So if you combine inland transportation, Copper, which is located in south, will be more helpful for you. And here it is by 40-feet container. From this perspective, we need to revisit what the best ports of call for Korean liners in the EU, because they will have an impact in the chains of building logistics centers. The supply chain includes the manufacturing stage, and we can also expect there will be more activities in terms of manufacturing as part of the supply chain for Korea. The Eastern Europe will be a new hub for manufacturing, especially the Korean manufacturers. Even now, Korean manufacturers have a production basis in Eastern Europe, and those manufacturers will have more business in the future, and we will see the number of manufacturers based in Eastern Europe increase. And the demand will be met, but as I said, the number of manufacturers in Eastern Europe will increase, and there will be a need for the number of logistic companies to increase as well. So I believe the Korean government needs to provide more support for logistic companies. This is almost the end of my presentation. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the requirements for the shipping and logistic companies. Large companies can cope with these changes in regulations and policies. But it's not the case for small and medium-sized logistic companies. They need more support especially administrative and legal supports. They also need to be provided with advice, and they also need consulting. This can be provided by building a support platform. Especially they need a local support when they need to deal with administrative issues. Next, we also need to increase the pool of human resources to meet local requirements and to effectively respond to changes in policies and regulations. We need more human resources, especially we need trainers who can provide education for Korean logistic companies that are doing business in other countries so that they can get more accustomed to local requirements. So I hope to see more educational or training programs. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.